So yeah, I guess I'll introduce myself a little first. I am a second-year law student. My name is Emery Roan. I got into Bitcoin. Well, I'll just say the first Bitcoin I bought was $8. The second Bitcoin I bought was $12, and I really should have realized at that point that I should have been buying a lot more. I was very lucky to get interested in Bitcoin at the right time and the right place, and I snatched up one of the Avalon mining. It was the second generation, or the first iteration of the ASICs miners, and it was an incredible opportunity, a great year of mining, and I was able to sell out right at the tip. So I've just been really fascinated with Bitcoin in particular. I come from sort of privacy law and cyber law perspective. Went to law school after the Snowden revelations. Sort of realized that there's a lot of need for lawyers to understand the technology side and that appreciate the privacy side. So I was really fascinated with the disruptive nature of Bitcoin and the idea that, more than the internet, it could be a democratizing force. It is, super, super interesting, and I'm very stoked to be here. So I'm just going to pass the microphone. Oh, you got your own microphone. We've got an excellent panelist. I think everyone here has spoken already except for me. But why don't you go ahead and reintroduce yourself, starting with Dimitri. Is that mic working?
Hi, everybody. I'm Dimitri. I am a project lead for Mycelium. I've been in Bitcoin. Actually, I also remember my first one was $6. My second one was $8, and kind of went up from there. So I've been in there for a while. I used to mine. I did a lot of investing type of stuff. I did trading. I basically moved my entire financial life to Bitcoin about 2.5 years ago. It's been going great since. And I'm working on, as I mentioned, Mycelium, and we are trying to kind of advance Bitcoin into the future.
I'm Daniel Krajewicz. I'm a founder of the Satoshi Nakamoto Institute. I also work for Mycelium. I mined over 100,000 Bitcoin right when it first came out, and I haven't sold a single one. Just kidding.
Wow.
Paul Rosenberg. I manage CryptoHippie, a professional level VPN. I write the Free Man's Perspective newsletter, and I've been interested and involved with digital currencies for a lot of years.
I'm Chris Odom. I'm the creator of the Open Transaction System and the co-founder of StashCrypto.com.
All right, great. So this is the last panel of the show, which I think really lets us gives us some flexibility here. I was hoping to keep this the most unscripted panel of the conference. I think we might be able to succeed there. Maybe the 2 panels ago was a little bit more unscripted, but basically the goal here is the panel is called The Future of Bitcoin, Bitcoin 2025. So this is the most armchair, quarterback, woo-woo, we get to make any of the predictions that we want kind of panel. So I've got my ideas of where I'd like to see Bitcoin in 10 years and where I think it's actually going to be in 10 years. I'd love to sort of start with that question, extremely broad, and maybe narrow it down if we have time. And yeah, if anyone has any questions, I know that probably the majority of the previous speakers and everyone else is outside because it's very cold. But go ahead and raise your hand in the middle of things. We're just going to try to keep it fast, keep it discussion-oriented, and yeah, if you have any questions, we'll answer them at the time. But yeah, so let's start with Dimitri, I guess Mycelium. Bitcoin 2025, 10 years from now, where would you like to see Bitcoin, and where do you see it actually being?
Well, since I'm the project lead for the top Bitcoin company, that's basically one and the same question because we're going to make it go where we want it to go. Absolutely. So I'd say maybe $1,200 to $1,300. I'm kidding. Price-wise, I have no idea. It might actually be predicting price that far ahead is pretty useless because I could say $3 million, but at that point, $3 million might buy you half a house. So, the actual blockchain, Bitcoin type stuff, I expect that people's identities, money, any kind of assets ownership will all be registered on the blockchain within 10 years. Everybody will have devices that are dedicated to storing hardware keys, so it'll be hardened hardware devices that are first and foremost there to prove who you are, prove how much money you have, and prove what you own. And as a secondary feature, they'll also run your video games and other junk. Like, so it'll be, instead of a phone that runs a wallet, it'll be a wallet that runs a phone. And it probably won't be called a wallet at this point either. Like, we don't have internet machines. We just have smartphones, computers, whatever else we come up. If you think about 10 years ago was about when smartphones first started out. Before then, everybody was using like Nokia dumb phones. So we've come pretty far, and I don't think anybody would have predicted, 8-core processor PCs running in our pockets. Regarding what I would like to see, it would be that, there's a thing called speculative attack. I suggest you Google Bitcoin speculative attack. If that should happen, we're all going to be rich if you have Bitcoin. And effectively, people realize that Bitcoin is a much easier, more convenient, and cheaper to use currency than anything else, so people just basically switch to that. And at that point, all business, commerce, interaction will be just as open across the entire world as email is today. So borders basically become meaningless.
Thanks for mentioning speculative attacks, because I forgot to talk about that at my talk earlier. One of the fun things about Bitcoin is that it completely changes your attitude about all the terrible things happening in the rest of the world. Because before I got into Bitcoin, I was like, oh no, unfunded liabilities, and now I'm like, yes, destroy everything as quickly as possible. All of that is great for Bitcoin.
Destruction, right?
Whatever, just burn it all. That's what I say. Bitcoin always does really well whenever governments do something really stupid. So I'm all for that. Now, to disagree with something that Paul said earlier, I think that the markets for Bitcoin will continue to be completely insane until Bitcoin either dies or takes over the world. I think that Bitcoin's growth is similar to a hyperinflation scenario, and I would recommend an article I wrote called Hyper-Bitcoinization. It's extremely short, but people get out of the currency that they are they grow up with because they're on a sinking ship, or because they're being squeezed to death, not because they're because they like making payments on their phone better. I don't know what governments are going to do. I don't have a specific prediction other than that Bitcoin will continue to be crazy.
Okay, what I would like for Bitcoin in 10 years, wow, I really don't care that much about the price. If it goes up in relative terms, that's always pleasant. It's easier to pay your bills. But I don't care all that much by itself. One of the, I obviously want Bitcoin to be widely accepted, widely used, all sorts of people to use it for all sorts of reasons. One of the things that I want is I would like for mining to modify somehow, and I don't have any prescriptions as to how. I don't study that in enough depth to really say. But right now there are dangers of mining groups getting too large. And so far it has to be said that they have behaved well, at least as far as I know. They haven't tried to get nuts. I would like there not to be such large mining groups. I would like mining to go back to the way it was intended, or at least part way back, so it's a lot of small miners instead of a lot of large miners. I think that's really important for the future. I would like the core devs the core developers to, how shall I say, be a solid conservative group of people who want to make Bitcoin better, who work to make Bitcoin better, but don't go off on tangents.
Could you elaborate on that? Sorry, what tangents are you alluding to, perhaps?
Well, a number of things. People who want to, let's have the foundation and we'll get this person involved, we'll get that person involved, we'll try to, let's cooperate with governments, let's not cooperate with governments, let's have a fork, and all this kind of stuff. The people who are core developers on something large need to be a fairly conservative group. I don't mean that they have to be rooted in the past. I don't mean that they need to be anti-change of any sort. But when you're dealing with something large, it has a lot of inertia, and you don't want it to switch directions all the time because it's not good for the entire market. So change, yeah, but don't be flitting back and forth.
So stability over everything else, right? 10 years from now?
Well, I would say
seems stable.
over everything else. There's other things that could take precedence over that, but all things being equal, stability.
That would be great, yeah.
When I look at Bitcoin, I look at it as a technology, and I can't say what I think is going to happen next year or the year after that precisely. That's not really the way I look at it, but the way I look at it is where that it is going based on what it is and what it solves. And it seems to me that proof of work is actually a hard limit, like a physical hard limit, like the speed of light or the uncertainty principle or something like that. Because when you look at other consensus systems, they always look great in theory. I've actually built one myself before, and just on my own time. They look great in theory, and they basically work properly, but then there's always these niggling little attacks. And whenever you work through the effort of solving those attacks, you always arrive back at proof of work. And I was also thinking that you see this in evolution, like the peacock's tail. There are many examples of this where this truth finding was evolved to occur. And the reason you have something like a peacock's tail is because it's a cue or an indicator of a certain accuracy of something that the other gender could pick up on accurately that is expensive to fake. The handicapping principle, right? And you see a lot of this in nature. Another example actually is a wedding ring or an engagement ring. Engagement ring is expensive. So it's expensive to lie with an engagement ring. It's cheap to say whatever you want, but it's expensive to lie. And the same is true in Bitcoin. It's expensive to lie. So I think it's a hard physical limit. And because of that impression that I have of it as this sort of pivotal innovation in history, sort of like the printing press or the internet, it makes me realize that it will win over all other consensus-based system and any other altcoin, especially one that's not based on proof of work. Any other system that's not proof of work. And so, and we all know that the obvious benefits of Bitcoin just as a technology over, dollars or any other normal currency like that. I just see, and this is my honest opinion, as someone who doesn't own a huge number of Bitcoin, I believe that sometime in the next decade or two, they will be worth hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars. That's actually just my opinion of it, but we'll see what happens.
I like that prediction. Hopefully, if anything else, yeah, our Bitcoins are worth $100,000. That would be great. So I guess when I met Stephen, I was presenting a panel. The panel was titled Bitcoin and the Internet of Things. Could Bitcoin or the blockchain technologies enable a secure Internet of Things? And so I think I'm right there with you, Chris, and that what really fascinates me about Bitcoin is the technology. So I think that we might get a little bit of distinction here between Daniel and Chris and myself. Personally, I think that if Bitcoin is going to take off anywhere, it's going to take off in America absolutely last. I think that's just fundamental. I mean, we operate on the fiat that is regulating the whole world, but there's lots of places where Bitcoin will be picked up solely because it is better than the fiat in that country. I think that if it's going to take off in America, we need some kind of killer app. So I've heard plans about BitID. I think is a fascinating implementation, getting rid of usernames and passwords with moving that kind of private application into the blockchain. Especially coming from like a cybersecurity and privacy law perspective, I really like the idea of blockchain or Bitcoin applications that really bring the privacy back to the individual. Maybe we can, modify these current streams, the current way that the internet is funded, rather than monetizing our personal information. We can fund it through microtransactions. So I guess with that in mind, the sort of general applications of Bitcoin and blockchain. Is that sentiment shared by anyone here? Is there any killer app that you think we're waiting on? If there is, any
I think
predictions?
Bernie Sanders is a Bitcoin killer app.
I'll toss something in. I wouldn't be surprised if the United States and the Western world in general did end up being at the forefront of a lot of it. And the reason I say that, now not large things, not governments and megacorps or any of that, forget about them. But among individuals, there's more interest in privacy services. There's more interest in the new things and new technologies amongst the Western countries than there are in other places. Whether it's because of education, whether it's because of traditions of entrepreneurship or traditions of trying to find the next cool thing, whatever it is, there's a fair amount of it. Obviously I would like everybody to get involved and everyone to, jump in right away and everybody, let's all go to the moon together. But I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of development ended up being underground, or at least in the non-hierarchical channels in the West.
I was going to say, sorry. As I mentioned, I've been using Bitcoin, I moved my entire financial life to Bitcoin for over 2 years now, but what you said, Bitcoin is probably not going to be first in U.S., and ironically, it's actually much, much easier for me to use Bitcoin for everything here, because I can use third-party intermediaries like Gift and Purse to buy pretty much everything I need. Whereas if I go to Europe or any other country, most of the time my option is to find somebody to trade Bitcoin with cash for. So, but at the same time, as Daniel said, an intermediary that takes Bitcoin and immediately converts it to dollars isn't exactly part of the Bitcoin economy either.
Well, I think that using a blockchain comes at a tremendous cost. It's a very cumbersome way of doing things, and the reason it works for Bitcoin is because we can't afford to have central institutions for currency at all. I think that many of the other applications that people want to use a blockchain for could actually be better done with open transactions. The thing that Chris was talking about earlier, that's called the handicap principle. There's a book called The Handicap Principle by Zahavi, which you should all read. It's really great. And it is definitely related to the way Bitcoin works. And I've been trying to write an article on that for a while, but I never got done with it.
Excellent. Okay, so is there any questions in the audience? I mean, does anyone have any questions? I can throw these out probably all day. Okay. Anyone from outside? Any questions? Okay. No? Okay. Great. Question. Here we go. I'll run this down to you.
So I have a question as far as this actually arose from Chris's talk yesterday. You're talking a lot about how key management is going to be a big deal, and how certificate authorities are basically a classic man-in-the-middle attack, which was a complete game changer for me because I never thought of it that way. But if the intention is to replace basically every cryptography system out there, are there people working on things like SSL keys from Bitcoin keys, or would that even work as far as the way the schematics, or not the schematics, but the way the protocol works?
And I guess I want to piggyback on that. Are there any lessons that the rest of the internet infrastructure at large should take from Bitcoin and blockchain? Do we see any implementations of some kind of technologies at the core of Bitcoin into the rest of the internet? And it's pretty open-ended. So, yeah, exactly.
How is it going to spread? Well, I think that the technology that Bitcoin uses is probably the hardest out there because of how much money is at stake. And so there's so much directed focus on the Bitcoin source code and the Bitcoin protocol because of the fact that there's money in it, and that's why you also see a lot of hack attacks and this sort of thing. In my system, we support RSA keys, and we use OpenSSL to do those keys. And so that's sort of the library that Open Transactions was originally written using. And we have an abstract interface for crypto, and then there's sort of a subclass of that or implementation of that implements that interface using OpenSSL. And recently we just finished adding another abstract interface for doing all the same crypto operations using ECC. Specifically, we're using the same code from Bitcoin, which is libsecp256k1. And so that's the reason that we chose to use that code, was because we figured this is going to be the best, most secure one, is because it's the one that Bitcoin uses.
Yeah. So sort of using the Bitcoin network as a way of really, really testing the metal of all of the underlying protocols that are used in other technologies.
Yeah, but also along the lines of your question, in Open Transactions, identity is also abstract, not just the crypto, right? The identity is abstract, and you can create an identity in any other existing system and then use that as the source for the identity in Open Transactions. So, for example, you can make a X509 certificate, you can make a self-signed cert, or you can get one issued by a certificate authority, and then you can use that as the source to create your Open Transaction pseudonym. And then later on, if you wanted to run your system like this, which I don't recommend, by the way, but there are certain business applications I can imagine where maybe a company wants to run it, and they want the ability to revoke certificates and reissue them and do that sort of thing. And so then you could verify that pseudonym in Open Transactions, and it would verify up to the certificate authority, because we just call the same OpenSSL function call that anyone else would call. But I think in the wider sense of things, that's not how it's going to go, except for sort of internal, intranet sort of applications, private blockchain sort of applications. But I think in the general wider sense, the standards that will be adopted will not be based on that, but will be based on people just storing their own keys and tools and protocols building up around protecting that, secret sharing and automated backups and all that sorts of thing, hardware wallets and hardware keys, trusted computing devices like rivets, that sort of stuff. Does that answer your question?
Kind of want to ask another prediction-oriented question. And I think about the end game, or just the kind of the resistance that maybe even phases of resistance that Bitcoin and censorship-resistant technologies that are open and distributed will go through, especially in the West. I just wanted to hear maybe some provocative predictions that I know you guys. I respect all of your minds a lot and the content you've produced, and big fan of Fellow Traveler in my earliest days of Bitcoin talk. Perusing, but yeah, I'd love to hear some controversial or provocative predictions about the what it might look like, the resistance that's put up by the folks who might not like censorship resistance.
I'll jump in on that. Be the bearer of bad news. The problem is, I'm sorry. The problem is that our enemies, if you want to look at it that way, own the physical infrastructure. That's a big vulnerability. Again, I talked about it in my presentation. What happens if they get good filtering routers, which is not that hard nowadays? What if they get them and they can filter out Bitcoin protocols? And what if they decide to do it? What do we do then? They own the physical infrastructure. This is a big issue. Now, we haven't had to deal with it yet, thank God, and I hope we never do. But it's a vulnerability. Now, there are ways around it. We can everything from stitching together mesh networks, high latency networks, latency just means slow, networks, things like this. We're just as smart as they are. We are much more adaptable. We can work on a much quicker time frame, but we have that risk. They own the physical infrastructure. And there's more, but I'll pass it to you guys.
Well, I mean, we can just use encrypted connections for Bitcoin. I mean, right? I mean, that particular issue doesn't seem like that big of a deal to me.
Okay.
China's outlawed VPNs.
Okay.
I'd say there's one really good news about government. Technology development and advancement has been kind of like this, and it's kind of doing this right now. Government regulatory time to pass regulation is about 2 to 3 years after something new is created, and that's always been pretty much level. So we're pretty much going to be getting to a point where we'll be having like 15 or 16 totally new designed ways of getting around stuff while they're still trying to pass regulations for the old ones. So in my view, I think it's going to be a little scary at first and then hilarious afterwards.
Oh, I just remembered that I wrote an article called Bitcoin's Shroud of Subtlety and Allure. And this is about how if Bitcoin starts to get a real mania behind it, then government officials are faced with the choice of actually trying to stop Bitcoin or just buying it and riding the wave. And so, it's quite possible that governments will not be able to coordinate an effective defense against Bitcoin because there's such a good incentive just to go and buy it.
I think that I'd like to piggyback on that before we have another question here, but I think that it's important to keep in mind that Bitcoin was created as a direct result of the 2008 financial crisis. And as much as I think that it's fascinating and a little funny sometimes hearing some of the people and the establishment or the established, talking about Bitcoin and adopting Bitcoin and blockchain technologies, because I feel like there's a tendency to understate or underplay or ignore completely the really unavoidable anti-statist elements that are at the core of Bitcoin. And I think that really recognizing that, yes, when government comes down on this, there's going to be a line drawn in the sand. There's going to be something that has to happen because in a lot of ways, these two technologies, government and Bitcoin, are not necessarily going to play nice together. So really interesting points in all accounts. I think I have another question.
My question was, aside from, I was just going to ask it straight out, what's the biggest Achilles heel of Bitcoin if the government decided it wanted to shut it down? And so obviously the network infrastructure is a huge one. Is there any one that's more obvious or than the one after that?
I was mining actually when Gigahash.io reached the 51% and then voluntarily shut off their own servers because they recognized that their own intrinsic worth was based fundamentally on the rest of the Bitcoin network trusting the security of the Bitcoin network. So frankly, I think that the 51% that Paul was talking about earlier, the mining decentralization, is really, I don't have a good solution to it. Maybe Chris would be better talking about proof of work, but yeah, I think that's a real threat. And
I'd actually be kind of wary of that because Gigahash didn't necessarily turn them off. They could have just pointed it at competing miners.
Bingo.
So they still make the same amount of money. It's just that there's still kind of, I guess, mining competition.
Yep.
Actually, regarding what the prior topic, I just remembered an excellent example. Uber has quite a lot of pushback from, taxi cabs and unions. But they're having a lot of trouble passing any kind of bans on Uber because all the senators around D.C. really, really love Uber. So in the same kind of way, regarding how do we kind of fight government, I think the best option is to get politicians to take Bitcoin and teach them how to do it under the table if they have to. So,
in regard to the 51% attack, because Bitcoin mining is anonymous, if you had 51% of the hashing, you can continue to mine without revealing this. And I would say that if we are able to identify an attacker with 51% of the network, we should be able to write code that would ignore his blocks. But if we're not able to identify such an attacker, then there isn't really an attack. He's just acting as if he's a bunch of different miners. So I think that I think it should be possible to respond to this kind of attack.
I think there's a lot of misconception out there too about a 51% attack. It's not something that actually keeps me up late at night. Bitcoin has achieved a practical degree of security, a practical distribution of risk, and it's not 100% perfect. But I think once you try and design a system that has 100% perfection, you end up with like the Federal Reserve. And so I would prefer, a practical distribution of risk. And also with a 51% attack, this doesn't mean that you can rewrite history either. You can't just play God. It means that maybe you could cause a fork from a certain point forward, or that maybe you could perform some sort of denial of service attack on certain transactions going through. And I might add, at your own expense, because if you had that much hashing power, you would normally be profiting from processing those transactions. So it's another case where it's like you really have to be a disinterested party with a huge amount of resources, an amount of resources that I don't think anyone has, by the way, or the
nation state.
Yeah, exactly. And not even, Bitcoin is much bigger than the United States. If people say, well, is a government going to shut Bitcoin down? Which government? The world powers? Yeah.
Yes, any more questions? I'm not sure how much time we have left. Are we good on? I know that we're already going over, I think, a lot of time. Oh, one more. All right.
Along these same lines, I have the same problem convincing my friends about Bitcoin. When I explain it to them, their first reaction is that, for sure the government's going to shut it down because it's directly opposed to their agenda. So my question is, since Bitcoin is a threat to the Federal Reserve and all the other countries' monetary schemes and agendas, I'm thinking, you can convince the senators that it's a good thing, or you can have this regulatory delay you were talking about that protects us. But the problem is the feds are run by bankers, and they're in bed with the executive branch of government. The executive branch of government has a way of bypassing the legislature and moving their agendas. So what is to prevent that from just instantly terminating it with some unforeseen methodology to move their agenda and bypass the legislative system, which to me is worrisome because they've already shown that that's what they do.
So I guess what sort of checks does Bitcoin have against the government?
Just really quick, I just wanted to say that if you have an institution such as the Federal Reserve or a banking system, and they're increasingly realizing that something is an actual threat to their existence, then I don't think you can avoid the effect where the bureaucratic shell starts to eat itself from the inside out, from all the little nibbling fishes, like fishes nibbling on a piece of bread when you throw it in the pond. There will be people on Wall Street, as prices go up and go down, who will be going in and trading on these things to profit by them. And there will be people who will be stocking away Bitcoin and so on. And I don't think that these corporate institutions or bureaucratic institutions can escape that effect. And so, but I also don't think that that government somehow goes away or ceases to have an influence. I think there will always be some form of governance in one form or another, and hopefully mostly based in cryptographic law. But one example I can give where I think we're going to continue to have at least local government is in things like property titles, property ownership, because I think you can prove things using the blockchain. You can prove things historically, like you might place an ad in the New York Times Classified to prove that a certain thing was a certain value on a certain day. You can put that sort of hash in the blockchain to prove this, but you can't have a judge order a transfer of ownership. Like, let's say that someone dies and leaves their house to their son, but then a judge has to adjudicate and give it to someone else or give it to a different relative. And if you had a property title that was registered on the blockchain and someone dies and loses the private key, right? Now, which property title is actually going to be honored by the local sheriff and the local courthouse? Is it going to be their records of who the owner is, or the blockchain's inaccurate record of who the owner is, right? So I think you can use the blockchain to sort of prove historical ownership of who said they owned it on a certain date or posted a hash from related to a court record. But I think you'll continue to have those court records because that's going to be what local judges are going to honor.
Yeah, I think that wasn't it just Russia in the past week or two that said that. I'm showing that my incredible lack of knowledge, but I think that they said that they basically forbid the people holding Bitcoins. And what you saw in the past week and a half is that local Bitcoin trading in rubles has just flown through the roof. I think the government does a really bad record of making things illegal and stopping people from using them. But yeah, I'd love to hear Daniel's answer to the underlying question about checks against, I guess, that kind of government takings.
I thought his question was about how to convince your friends that the government can't destroy Bitcoin.
Well, you can answer that question too. It's fine.
I have an article called How to Market Bitcoin, which you should read. And basically the way that a thing can become a currency is that people have to invest in it. And they have to do it a little bit at a time to prove to each other that they're serious. That's how money develops. So if your friends aren't ready to invest, then just say, I'm not worried about that, and just, let them wait a while, and some news will come out. And so I would say that marketing Bitcoin has to do with enticing other people to invest in it, not trying to push it on people too much.
Well, my answer to that is that Bitcoin is just a list of accounts and their balances, and when you send Bitcoin transactions, effectively all you're doing is sending a message that a computer can parse. It says from account A to account B, send so much money. Bitcoin protocol that's what it is. So essentially, Bitcoin at its very core is simply language. So anybody can meet somebody else over the phone or in person and say, here, write down this 250-character gibberish sentence, whatever, and I sent you a Bitcoin. So in order for governments to actually effectively ban Bitcoin, they would basically have to ban all forms of communications and language, which is kind of impossible. If you've noticed my kind of a slightly funny-sounding accent, I'm from USSR. We had very strict regulations on any kind of speech. Typewriters were all registered, and if you wanted to get a typewriter, you had to specifically register with forms in the government because they didn't want you printing anything that would be against them. So it was very, very strict, tight controls on everything, including all the phone lines were being listened to and stuff. And yet still we had a whole lot of illegally printed books, illegally printed like newsletters. News would still go around. Because language is really, really hard to kill, because at the very last resort, we still have vibrations through the air to send it by.
Yeah, I think I really agree with that. I think that, Bitcoin's killer app is its resilience, is its decentralization, and the fact that at its core it's just communication. I think that's all the questions that we have time for today, though. I really want to give a round of applause to our panelists here, as well as all the panelists outside enjoying the warmer weather.